So let me attempt to conceptualize the debate around a few key ideas tonight. So as far as I see it, there are, well, maybe more, but at least three key areas of disagreement here. One is the question of objectivity. So how can we have an objective basis for moral claims if there is no God? Like this is the essential notion of whose desire or whose morality that John has been discussing. The second point is this question of the is-ought problem. How do you get from is claims to ought claims? And the third question that I'm broadly conceiving of is how good is theistic ethics as providing an account of the grounding for moral values? I've argued that it is inadequate, and John obviously disagrees with that. So I want to address these three key areas in turn. The first that I want to start talking about is objective basis for morality. I had hoped that my slides were numbered, but they're not, so sorry about that. Now I need to figure out... Yes, it's this one I want. Sorry about that. So, what basis do we have for making moral claims if there is no God? So, who decides? Basically is the question. The thing is, I think that this is a mistaken way of conceiving of the problem. The question is not who decides what's right or wrong, or who decides what desires matter or something like that. The question is what reasons can be given to make in favour of a particular argument or a particular moral position. Because you can ask this claim of who decides about anything, about scientific evidence, who decides whether something is scientifically proven, about a mathematical proof, who decides whether the proof is adequate, about historical evidence, about what is the actual interpretation of the law. I think there is a confusion here between things that are difficult to find out, and therefore which there can be intelligent disagreement about, and things that are impossible in principle because there's no fact of the matter. It may well be, in fact I think it self-evidently is the case, that moral issues are really hard. There's a lot of disagreement about lots of particular things, and some of that disagreement is within culture, some of it's cross-cultural. None of that disagreement means that there is no possibility of morality without God. Because we have disagreement in all sorts of areas. We have scientific disagreement, we have disagreement about history, we have disagreement about law, disagreement about all sorts of things. We don't infer from that there's no fact of the matter, that there's no objective truth. It just means it's hard to find out. In order to infer that there's no fact of the matter, there's no actual objective truth, we would have to have some reason for saying there just can't be an objective truth. And that isn't really given by just simply asking the question, well, who decides? Who decides anything? An account is given, evidences are provided, and we give arguments and evidence, and that's how anything is decided, essentially, by attempting to weigh up the arguments. Also, in regards to the question about, to the example raised about, in regards to Railton's reductive theory of naturalism about considering different human desires, the idea is not that you just take a poll and if 51% vote for the Holocaust, then you go ahead. That's absurd. That's not what Railton thought at all. The idea is you weigh up the extent to which the desires, or the idealized sort of fully rational desires of different individuals are satisfied by different courses of action. Now, according to this analysis, there's no simple way of saying, well, one person gets one vote on any moral question because different things impact people differently. It doesn't matter how many people would have voted for the Holocaust, because the extent to which it hampered the desire fulfillment of the people who were killed and whose families and communities were destroyed, just dramatically and completely overwhelms whatever petty desires were satisfied by those who were in favour of it. And I mean, this is the case for any sort of moral question. It's always a question of weighing up the interests of different people. And sometimes that's really hard. In the case of the Holocaust, it really isn't hard at all. It's just obvious. In other cases, it really is hard. So an example I might give is abortion. It's actually really hard to weigh up the interests of the unborn fetus versus the mother and maybe other parties as well. And so there's a lot of disagreement about that. But that doesn't imply that there's no fact of the matter and there's actually no real morality. Okay, so that is what I wanted to say about the general question of objectivity. Or is it actually? No, yes, it is. So what I wanted to talk about next is the is-ought question. How do we get an ought claim from is? I have some slides on this. I should have numbered my slides so I know which one's which. So many rebuttals, so little time. Okay, there's some confusion, I think, about this issue of the naturalistic fallacy because there's a few different things that sometimes go by that name. The naturalistic fallacy by that name in ethics refers to a specific argument used by a philosopher called G.E. Moore. The idea is that, according to him, you can't define good in terms of any natural property, like desirable, for example, because they're not the same thing. There's a lot of complexity there, but that's the basic argument. It's about defining one thing in terms of another. Then there's the is-ought problem, which is specifically the one raised by Hume. And here the argument, as I presented it, is you can't get ought conclusions from purely is premises. Then there's also the appeal to nature, which is saying that something is good because it's natural, as in like organic's an example. So organic food is better than food with pesticides because it's natural, something like that. That's the appeal to nature, and that doesn't really have too much to do with what we're talking about tonight. No one says that something is good just because it happens to be that way in nature. The argument is we can look at the natural world and study it and find good things about it based on our account, given relative deductive account that I'm using, of what is good and bad. Not that simply we take what is given to us by the natural world and everything there is right. Now, the criticism that any attempts to overcome the is-ought fallacy are merely hand-waving are, I think, an exaggeration. There is still disagreement among philosophers about how we can deal with this. What I have argued this evening is that this problem of going from an is premises to an ought conclusion, that's not really what I'm talking about, so I don't know why I did that, is not specific to morality. It's a broad question of how do we go from talking about one sphere of discourse, one type of thing, say chemistry, to talking about something different, biology. You always need to include that extra premise that does the linking, and it's not circular or hand-waving to do that. You need to do it for in any case where you're moving from talking to one thing to talking about something else. And so I don't think that there is a problem with doing that in the case of morality, nor do many other philosophers. Now, there was also an argument that we don't relate to this problem of is-ought, and this is why I wanted to use this slide. So Moore, who raised the naturalistic fallacy, which is related to is-ought, actually argued very specifically that most forms of non-naturalism, which would include theism, commit this fallacy as well. Because if we merely say, God commanded it, that's an is statement. How do you get from God commanded it to we ought do it or not do it? That is still provides for an is-ought gap potentially. Now, I think you can cover that gap by using an argument that I've made. But if you're going to say that the is-ought is a fundamental problem, then the theist needs to give an explanation as to why it doesn't apply to theistic ethics. Because any claim about what God does, or what God is like, or what Jesus taught, or anything, is an is claim. How do you get from that is claim to an ought conclusion if, by the assumption, it's just impossible to do that? And Moore saw this very explicitly when he made this argument. And in fact, I think Hume did as well, because he was quite critical of religion as well. So many philosophers considering this question realise this, and they don't consider this is-ought problem to be an argument in favour of theistic ethics. Okay, so that was the is-ought problem. The next thing that the third topic that I wanted to discuss is the question of theistic ethics and the how good it is as an explanatory account. John mentioned before that he said that we are invited to taste and to see that God is good. It's not merely that God is defined to be good or something like that. We're invited to experience him and to learn about him. But if there is no actual external basis for saying these type of things are good and these type of things are bad, then how can we taste and see that God is good? All we can taste and see is that God is like this. But how do we know that that's good? There has to be some basis or standard with which we use. I'm saying that that standard is, what fulfills human desires, and then we consider that across people and what's socially rational and all that stuff that I talked about. Well, all that John has said is that it's according to what God says. But why does that define what is good and bad? There's no argument presented. It's merely asserted that this is the case. And this relates to another criticism that was made, that by asking these sorts of questions about how do you know that God is good, and how do you know that Jesus is worth worshipping? I'm not letting God be God. We're sort of presuming moral relativism. So let me rephrase the epistemological question that I raised in regards to Jesus, because it may be the case that God is God and God is good. Like, if there is a God, then God is good. So the question is not, is God good? The question is Jesus God? Is this particular being that I've read about in the New Testament God? To be God, he needs to be good. We've established that. God has to be good. So is Jesus good? Good. Jesus has to be good in order to be God. How do you know if Jesus is good? You can't look at what Jesus did and said, because you don't know you can't judge that to be good or bad unless you already know who God is and what he commanded. And you can't just look at what Jesus commanded because you don't know if Jesus is God. You need some other basis for determining that. So that's the argument about moral epistemology. There's no basis for making moral claims unless you already know, in a sense, what your conclusion is. So, to summarise, I think that there's a few key issues in this debate. There's the question of objectivity. I think the question of objectivity is sort of overstated. I don't see how merely asserting that God exists and God says this really answers the objectivity question at all. It merely says that God says something, but how do you know that that's good? And how do you know that this being is actually God? And how does that bridge the is-ought gap if indeed we're worried about this? That leads to the second point, the is-ought gap. Why is this a specific problem specific to ethics and not a broader problem of really trying to move from talking about anything to anything else, like chemistry to biology? And as I said before, how does the theistic account of morality get around this if it's something that plagues the naturalistic account? And the third issue of theistic ethics, how can we say that what God commands is good when, just by definition, what is good is what God commands? That's the circularity of the moral ontology that I talked about. And secondly, how do we address the problem of knowing what goodness is when we need some sort of external standard in order to judge that, which we don't have? Again, how can you taste and find out that God is good if you don't know what good tastes like because you haven't found good yet? So I think those are some of the issues that this debate stands around, and hopefully we'll be able to cover some of these more in the discussion. So thank you very much.